Welcome everyone to our event today. There's still people joining, so we'll just wait a couple more seconds for everyone to enter the room. Right, so welcome again to our event today, No Limits to Growth, a societal transformation scenario for staying below 1.5. My name is Linda Schneider. I'm with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. So first of all, I would like to thank Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie in Leipzig for collaborating with us on this study and also on this event today. And just a couple of housekeeping information. So all of you online on Zoom can use the Q&A tool. You can use it to ask questions to the panelists, and you can also vote for questions so that we can pick the most popular ones. Also the chat box, you can use that for, as you're already doing, for exchanges amongst the whole group, and we'll also use it to share some additional information like links or other resources. And you're also welcome to share materials that you feel like sharing. Okay, so before I give you some background on why we did the study that we're presenting today and the discussion that we're trying to kick off, I would like to introduce our two speakers today, and also thank them very much for joining us today. So maybe both of you, Kai and Diana, can turn on their cameras. So first, Kai Kuhnhen, who works with the Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie in Leipzig, and has previously worked with the Federal Environmental Agency also on climate mitigation scenarios, and he's one of the co-authors of the study we're discussing today. Secondly, Diana Oerge-Vorsatz, who's a professor at Central European University and a vice chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC for short. And yeah, so we're very grateful for having both of you with us today for the discussion. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
So maybe just some short background on the discussion we're trying to kick off today. So basically back in 2018, when the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees came out, we realized that many of the scenarios, or most of them, relied on large-scale so-called negative emissions, and many of them also implied a dangerous temperature overshoot of 1.5. So overshooting the 1.5 temperature limit and then trying to return to 1.5 by the end of the century. At the same time, what we did was publish a short analysis of assumptions of economic growth in the available scenario literature. And we found that virtually all of them rely on economic growth across all regions and until the end of the century, and potentially even beyond, but that's where the scenarios stop, so we don't really know. And from our perspective, that's quite a big problem, because we both find it very dangerous to rely on those large-scale technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere that are neither tested nor proven at scale, and that also come with large-scale social and environmental risks. And also, we find it really dangerous to to bet on an overshoot and then return to a climate of 1.5 afterwards. So what we realized is that we also need to explore mitigation options that are beyond the mainstream of current mitigation scenarios, and also beyond the current growth dependent mainstream of scenarios. So then together with a team of 5 researchers, what we did was to start developing the scenario that we just launched last week and that we're presenting today in this event, which we call the societal transformation scenario. And that is at least one of the first to limit global warming to 1.5 without relying on risk technologies like CCS, geoengineering, and nuclear energy, but that instead explores at least some options of limiting production and consumption in the global north. So to the extent that we want to call the STS, as we call it, the societal transformation scenario, to the extent that we want to call it a degrowth scenario, it's very important for us to stress that those reductions in production and consumption occur in the global north, and then in turn allow for an increase in consumption in the global south. Before I hand over to Kai to give us a short input and presentation on the scenario that we did, we also find it important just to flag that the scenario that we did really is meant as an invitation to debate for a debate on what potential future trajectories and what potential futures are available to us as society. So it's not meant as any sort of prescriptive route to take, obviously. So take it as an invitation to debate and not as, there's no claim to perfection or any of that. So yeah, I think I'll leave it here for just my first introductory comments, and I'll hand over to Kai to give us an input on the scenario that we did.
Yes, thank you very much, Linda, for the introduction, and I also welcome all the viewers. My name is Kai. I work for the Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie, or Laboratory for New Economic Ideas in English. And I'm going to try to tell you as much as I can about the societal transformation scenario in 15 minutes. So let me just share my screen, and then you can see what I see. All right, Linda already talked a little bit about the motivation, and I'm going to talk about the key premises now. Start with the key premises. We had 4 of them. The first one was that the countries of the global north have to act. The second one, that consumption and production have to be reduced. The third is that a good life for all with less is possible. And the fourth is an exclusion of nuclear and negative emission technologies. I'm not going to talk a lot about the first 2, but I will start with the third. And if there's questions about the first 2, we can have them in the discussion later on, maybe. All right, a good life for all with less is possible. There's a lot of mainstream economic arguments against this, and I will present them, and then also present rebuttals from the degrowth or post-growth community. The first one is that production and consumption can be decoupled from emissions. So there's actually no need to make do with less. And the answer to this is that this is not true, or at least has never happened to the extent that we need it. Usually, whenever it happens, it's the emissions are only exported to other countries. The second is that material wealth correlates with well-being. So any scenario where we have less material wealth is actually a dystopian scenario, and it's something that nobody could really want. And to that, there are 2 answers. One is that this correlation is actually not true anymore in saturated societies. And secondly, that well-being is multidimensional, and degrowth or post-growth proponents actually say that there's a lot of our needs that we sacrifice in order to produce more and consume more, such as protection, creativity, idleness, and freedom and participation. And then the third point is that the third argument is that without more production and consumption, we face a recession, a crisis, social hardships, and so on. And this is, of course, true if we look at the kind of degrowth we see in the real world, which is not what we imagine when we talk about this topic. And I would say that that's why we say that it has to be part of a socio-ecological transformation and not just a reduction of consumption and no other changes. This is about, and now to the fourth premise, the exclusion of nuclear and negative emission technologies. First of all, what do we mean with this? There's a couple of things that fall under this. BECCS is very much in the debate. It's the use of biomass and then capturing the CO2 of the emissions and store it underground. CCS is the same, but with fossil fuels. CDR is carbon dioxide removal. It's taking CO2 from the atmosphere and actually storing it underground again. And then we have more out there solutions like solar radiation management, where we actually try to reduce the incoming sunlight or reflect it on some other ways. And then there's of course all other kinds of things like ocean, putting stuff in the ocean to make it absorb more CO2. And we have two problems with this. One is that we kind of see this path that we're on. Let's say humanity is this train and we're on this path and we're heading towards a cliff. And this cliff is, of course, a catastrophic climate change. And we just assume or we hope that by the time we reach the cliff, there will be a bridge. And this bridge is, of course, these negative emission technologies. And it's not only will it be there, but it will work fine, and the consequences of it will be bearable. And I'm very much doubtful about that, or I'm fearful of these solutions. I think they're very risky. And I think what we don't see is that we can actually slow down the train and maybe make it take another path. This is the one thing. And the other one is that if we go the route of reducing consumption and production, this can actually be a democratically planned process. We can decide together what we want to produce and what kind of labor and environmental degradation we can accept for this production. And this should be a planned process. We don't argue for something else. Instead, if we rely on these negative emission technologies, because they're these large-scale technologies, that we have to rely on governments and corporations to make the right decisions, to develop the technology, to create the right legal framework, to put in place the right incentives, and employ it responsibly. And when I look at the governments around the world, but especially if I look around the companies, especially multinational corporations, I'm very fearful that they will do this in a reasonable manner. So much for the premises. Now to the methodology. Usually when you make global mitigation models, you use what is called an integrated assessment model. And there's like 5 or 6 in the world that are being used by very few people. And they're very complex models, a lot of data, but also the math is not that simple. And they're a black box for most of the people, for the large majority. And there's also a lot of data that is not being presented, and the documentation is not as good as at least I would like it to be. And the second thing is that they don't try to just present what will happen if we do this and that. They don't say if we do A, then B will be the result, but they try to optimize. They try to find out what is the best scenario to reach a certain mitigation target. What is the cost-efficient way to stay within 1.5 degrees? And in order to do that, they need cost estimates. They need cost estimates for fossil fuels, but also for renewable energies. And they need these estimates until 2100, which I think is a rather difficult task to come up with these cost estimates, because usually, in my experience, it's hard to foresee what the oil price will be in 5 years, let alone in 50 years. And then secondly, to make these optimizations, you have to have certain moral and ethical choices, like what do you actually optimize on? And usually what they optimize on is consumption per person. So there's a lot of questions that are being answered, like, do we actually want to save the climate now or later? And there we have the interest rate that comes in. Or do we want to have more leisure time, or do we want to consume more as a people? And all these questions are put into these algorithms, and they are not open for debate because nobody actually knows what's in these models. So I think they're actually good tools, maybe for short or midterm scenarios, but not for the long term. Instead, we used something called the global calculator, which is a rather simple tool. It's actually you can find it online actually and use it yourself. It's open source. There's actually an Excel file that you can just download. We had to adapt some of it for our purposes. So it's not perfect, but I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And there's no optimization, so all the decisions lie with the users. Like you have to decide how many kilometers will be driven with a car or with a train, and how much meat will be eaten, and all these things, and what kind of technology will be used. And I think that's a big plus as well. And I think these things enable actually an open discussion about not what kind of mitigation technology is how expensive, or what kind of technologies we want to use when, but actually how do we want to live in 2050 or 2100. And I think that's the discussion we need to have in a very democratic and broad society. All right, now the assumptions, and I'm just going to talk about the consumption side here, because that's like the special thing about a scenario. Like the technological side, this is in all the scenarios, but this is other things that are distinct in ours. And I'm just going to point out a few. In the transport sector, for example, we assume that by 2050 we have 81% less cars in urban areas and 52% in rural areas. And the flights per person fall to 1 per year in 2025 and one flight every 3 years in 2050. And of course, this is all only valid for the global north. For the global south, actually, these consumption parameters, we expect them to increase, so that by 2050 we have some kind of convergence. And now coming to housing and food, I just want to point out two things. We assume that the living space will be reduced by 25% per person. Now, that does not mean that every room will be shrinking or anything like that. It could also just mean that we have less single households and more communal living and trends like that. And then finally, meat consumption. We assume a reduction of meat consumption in the global north by 60% by 2030, and then remain constant. And that is very important, especially red meat is a very big driver of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we have all these very ambitious technological developments. These, without any like ambitious technological developments, it's actually, I think it's not possible to stay within 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. So this is also a lot of data, but that I cannot present here because it would need too much time. But you can find it in the study. All right, and of course these are very dry numbers, and we try to make clear in the study that these numbers have to be part of a bigger transformation, which we call a socio-ecological transformation. And the goal of it would be to refocus our society to fulfill human needs and not grow the GDP or whatever, and to foster cooperation, care, solidarity, and sustainability in order to achieve a good life for all. Now, I understand this is quite abstract, so I brought a few first measures that would be important. For example, taxing the use of the environment more and not taxing labor as much, reducing working hours, introducing a basic income and a maximum wage. So as you can see, of course, redistribution is a very big topic in this scenario, redistribution of wealth and power. But we also have cultural changes like deceleration of life, and we, of course, the democratization of decision making. And I don't only mean like referendums or local referendums, but I also mean, for example, in your company, like too many, like the decision making in companies is very, very hierarchical, and very few people decide what is actually being produced and how. And of course, we imagine this all through a bottom-up process. We don't believe that there's a master plan that we should follow, but these things have to evolve and have to be done together with a lot of people to talk about these things. All right, now to the results. I just show the highlights. This is the energy demand in Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries is sort of the OECD countries or the global north in short. And we see decreases in demand from 2020 on, and these are the result of course, the less consumption, but also more efficiency. And these drops are significant, especially in the transport and building sector, and a little bit less in the industrial sector. Industrial is the cyan or line. And that is because the industry still has to do some heavy lifting when it comes to the energy transition. A lot of wind power plants have to be built and stuff like that. Now, this is the same figure for non-Annex 1 countries or the Global South. And there we see that actually in the industry, the energy demand increases and the decreases in the other sectors are also much less pronounced. And that is because we don't assume a reduction in consumption, and the decreases are only the result of more efficiency. Now, this is the resulting primary energy production, and this is globally, that's the whole world. Of course, since the energy demand is dropping, the primary energy production also drops, and we see that the fossil fuels become very negligible. In 2050, they make up less than 10%. And we also see a phase out of nuclear, that's at the very bottom, and we see a large increase in solar, wind, and tidal energy to become the bulk of our primary energy production. And now of course, the most important result maybe is the emissions. In red, you can see the emissions from 2020 to 2100 in gigatons CO2. And we see that by 2030, we have a reduction of 50%. So actually, that's like, if you want to make these ambitious mitigation targets, you have to have very, very strong decreases in greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade. And then by 2050, the emissions are further reduced by 72%. And then I want to point to the orange area below the zero line. That is actually the CO2 emission reductions from changes in land use. Because since we throw away less food and we eat less meat, we actually have a lot of former agriculture area that becomes free, and it can be used to restore natural ecosystems, or it can be managed sustainably, and thereby becoming a sink for CO2 emissions. And we assume that they go up to 4 gigatons per year of a sink, which is a conservative guess, and this is a figure that stays constant from, I think, 2050 on. And the cumulative emissions are 320 gigatons in our scenario, which would give us a 2/3 chance or a 66% chance to stay within 1.5 degrees. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the questions and also the comments by Diana.
Thank you very much, Kai, for this presentation. Maybe we can just start briefly with a couple of clarification questions, perhaps. Some of them were in the chat box already. So one reviewer has pointed out that the year in which our scenario hits net zero is in a way quite late, in 2062. So maybe you could just comment on why that is and why that was actually in a way a conscious decision that we took.
Yes, from a purely scientific point of view, as I said, it's most important that a lot happens in the next decade. But I understand. I mean, I worked at the Environment Agency. I understand the necessity for having these targets, and I think 2050 is a very reasonable target for net zero emissions in the global north. We don't have it in this scenario because we actually don't have the emissions distinguished between the global north and global south. We don't have the information. That is one reason why we have this number of 2062 and not 2050. And the other is that in the model there's a few processes that rely on fossil fuels, such as primary steel production, where you need coking coal, and that is something that was true until few years ago, but and the model actually has no alternative. But now there are alternatives already underway and being introduced. So that's maybe just a little shortcoming of the model, that there's no alternative.
There's another set of questions around our assumptions on population development in the global north and in the global south. Maybe you can comment on our assumptions there, and also a question around how to provide a good life for 9 or 10 or 11 billion people on the planet, without environmental collapse or runaway climate change.
Yes, the population question, I would have to look what the what our scenario was. I think we rely on the scenario for population stems from the medium variant of the UNDP World Population Prospect 2019 report, and you can find more in the report. It foresees an increase in population, but not a very steep. And the second was how it's possible to I think right now we're doing a very bad job providing a good life for people on this planet while trying to protect the environment. I think if we started redistributing our wealth, we would already be in a much better position. And I think there's a lot of room for redirecting our idea of what it means to have a good life and get away from this very material idea of the more I have, the more I possess, the better my life is, to a situation where you say the more time I have, for example, the more leisure time I have, the more relationships I have, the better my life is. And I think this is a transformation that we have to make, and that I think is more like the simple answer for now.
Okay, and I guess as another sort of answer to that question, we could also say that right now it's also not, the problem is not the number of people on the planet, right? But rather the levels of consumption and the overall levels of production globally that not necessarily benefit anyone on the planet. Why is that word so difficult? Okay, right now I'd like to invite Diana to come on stage, turn on her camera, if that's possible. And if you would like, just respond to what you've heard to the scenario. Let us know what you think and what your assessment is of the relevance, perhaps, of such scenarios that explore alternative mitigation options beyond the mainstream, if you will.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the opportunity to say a couple of thoughts based on these very interesting new scenarios. First of all, let me play a little bit of the devil's advocate and just defend the IAMs to some extent. It's true that there has been a lot of criticism, a lot of concern about their black box nature, but there is a strong effort in making them more accessible and more transparent. For example, the Sixth Assessment Report is putting a very major emphasis on an annex in which a lot of these assumptions detailed, and also there are many. There is, for example, a website on the IASA where you can actually, you yourself can play with the scenarios, change inputs and see how the outputs are then changing. So to some extent, you can control some of the parameters yourself. So it's not absolutely as evil as it has been projected. And there are not only 5 or 6 IAMs, but actually a lot of IAMs. I wouldn't be able to tell the number, but there are at least 20, so dozens of IAMs, and they have many, many runs. Nevertheless, I think by and large, the points that were raised in this presentation are very valid concerns, reflecting a lot of the scientific community. So the concern about the over-reliance or a very heavy reliance on negative emissions technologies, and perhaps nuclear less, but definitely that's That's a concern that many of the scientists have as well, also within the IPCC. I would recommend, for example, a paper from, I think, Kevin Anderson and Glenn Peters from Science, which is titled "The Trouble with Negative Emissions." And that also very nicely outlines some of these concerns, or summarizes a lot of the literature. But there are other papers which are excellently summarizing. So as a recognition of these concerns, actually there have been some efforts to produce scenarios that avoid these. Unfortunately, so far only one such scenario exists, which also made it into the mainstream IPCC presentations. But for example, also the 1.5 degree report of the IPCC depicts the lead scenario, the low energy demand scenario, which also lacks, doesn't rely on negative emissions technologies, and has already, although it doesn't articulate any principle of degrowth, but it already works with another scenario of economic development. And certainly the IEM community, or the community near the IEMs, near the integrated assessment modelers, there is a strong community developing who is working on scenarios which are closer, not fully as stringent on degrowth as this particular scenario, but there are more and more there is more and more recognition that that we do have to question the at least the rate of growth and how far that growth is taking place. Now, from the perspective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's this is a very difficult concept, because I think, Linda, you already hinted at this, that there is, of course, a very major gap between the global north and the global south in terms of where we are with consumption levels and where we are with fulfilling our, what you call, human needs. But simply already the question, you put the question in the presentation, let's us determine how we live in 2050. Now, that's a very difficult question. Who is the we? Who is the we who get to determine how much we should consume and what's the optimal level of consumption? And it's probably a difficult question even in the global north. To me, the most vivid proof of this is the pandemic, or not necessarily the consumption, but one would think that in our societies, certainly lives matter more than economic growth, right? But still, it is our richest societies which have failed the worst in protecting lives against economic interest in the pandemic. And it is precisely some of the poorer countries who have excelled much better in protecting their lives in the pandemic. So I think it's not that easy to say that if the people are allowed to have their say, what will happen. But anyway, that takes a bit, it's a bit of a side route of my discussion. So I was discussing how in IPCC we are addressing this. But the point is that yes, certain, many IPCC in intergovernmental panel. So it's important to understand that our principles are that we are policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And some countries are very sensitive about us assessing options, or at least bringing options to a high level in the IPCC, which may assume that somebody else is trying to prescribe their living standards and putting a cap on their development. And there is a very high level of sensitivity to this, especially if you understand our history of colonization and so on. This is especially sensitive. Nevertheless, I think one of the important words to degrowth, which you haven't mentioned, Kai, but in the literature that resonates very much with the concept of sufficiency. So sufficiency does appear, for example, in the outline of the sixth assessment report, government accepted outline in sixth assessment report. So we do expect that also the final assessment report will discuss this concept. And also it's very important that the first time in the IPCC history, we have a whole chapter devoted to demand and services. So that is exactly where we are discussing these. How can we influence energy demand? How do we still supply services, which is also very much resonate with your concepts of good life or well-being, or I don't remember what were the words you exactly used for it, but that was the older concept of this, that actually we don't need energy per se, we don't need CO2 emissions per se. What we need is a good life. What we need is services from the energy. So let's see how we can supply these services without actually having to compromise, without having to increase energy demand and emissions. So these are going to be addressed in the sixth assessment report. So let me see if there was anything else that I wanted to add. For example, one thing is that I think the number of appliances may not necessarily be a good indicator of, because, for example, also the lead scenario showed that, in fact, today, just one appliance actually substitutes about 20 appliances that we have now in the household, and replaces a lot of the needs. So there is some level of technological development which helps towards this goal, but absolutely that's true that I think there is a recognition that in a long time decoupling has never taken place. One item that I think is extremely important to understand, and I don't know how much this can be recognized, is that we are not talking about averages, and I think that's what is the trick, but it's personal view. That's also important for IPCC to make our readers understand, and then it's these concepts will be less controversial, that even in the global north there are tremendous inequalities. So even for us, it's I forgot the exact number, but the report came out just a few weeks ago again, that just 0.1% of the population emits I think a few dozens of the total emissions. So so that's also why population is a bit irrelevant, because it still shows that in the last 4 decades, the global south, even though population increased by more than 2-fold, their emissions virtually haven't increased at all. Nevertheless, those of the richest, just during the pandemic, the 1% of the global population gained I forgot, but maybe someone else knows better, but a very significant amount of wealth during just these couple of months. So clearly the issue is much more about these inequalities of emissions, and that's very much true in the global north as well. So when we talk about sufficiency or capping growth, then I think what we really need to question is where do we draw that line, and how do we achieve that? And just one final point final concept where I want to draw your attention to, which is really important, the so-called decent living standards. This is the term that has been used a lot in the scientific literature about this, and there is, of course, a lot of discussion. What is the decent living standards, which you called, I think, human needs? Where can we draw that line? How can we make people happy and fulfill their needs, but not cause overconsumption? And that, for example, what's her name? Anyway, one of our authors, I will remember her name, yes, Julia Steinberger, for example. She is one of the very important scholars, young female and very dynamic scholars, who produces a lot of literature on this. And she's also an author on the sixth assessment report, for example. So we definitely have authors in the report who are addressing these issues. So I think instead of seeing this black and white, I think it's more productive to see the whole society debate about this question and how perhaps we can have a wider community on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. So that was very, very rich and a lot of aspects that we can pick up upon. Maybe just one follow-up question on AR6, so the upcoming 6th assessment report that is coming out sometime next year or the year after, depending on COVID-19 timelines. So are you expecting, if you look at what is happening in the literature and in the modeling community debates, are you expecting a lot more scenarios that, for example, try to limit consumption and production in the global north, like the LED scenario did, or is that something you're expecting to happen?
My understanding is that there are now more such scenarios. I don't know yet, and I shouldn't tell anyway how many or whether these will make it into highlight into illustrative scenarios, but there are definitely more such scenarios being produced. Unfortunately, they are still in the minority, and that's certainly a concern still of the scientific community. But summarizing it, where in general the scientific community is that, for example, I don't think I'm giving anything important out, but we had a very interesting discussion on the summary for policymakers of Working Group 3 just last week on communications and the high-level messages. And it all boiled down to the key authors of and the key CLAs, the collaborating lead authors, not fully agreeing on the question whether technology only can do it, whether we need even a transition, or whether we need a transformative change, or whether we can just solve it all by technology. So when you are, there are so fundamental debates yet in the scientific community, I think the debate that you are showing is a further step from that. But then anyway, I think this is a very important and very interesting debate to have. And I think it's also a very enlightening debate within the scientific community. And it's great that now we will have the latest facts, because ultimately what the IPCC will do is we'll put down the different scenarios. And then the decision or such conclusions can be from the people. But what is important to understand, and Kai already very well emphasized this, that IAMs are just one type of modeling tools. They are very important and very strong, and they have great values because they are the only ones which we know right now who can actually tie a temperature goal to very detailed energy consumption patterns and energy futures. Nevertheless, they are only one type of modeling, and they have shortcomings, as every model has shortcomings, because no model can ever reproduce the whole reality, because the model means that it's a simplified version of reality. So it's always important to look at also other types of modeling tools. For example, last week we had a whole week of workshops funded by the Japanese government, which were precisely on this. What are the other modeling communities doing who are not working with IEMs, but bottom-up models, engineering economic models, socioeconomic models, and other social science models? And how can these also complementary inform policymaking as much as IEMs? Today, the problem is that the reason why we are relying mostly on IEMs, first of all, because they are the easiest to tie ourselves to temperature goals, but also because these other models, we have not been able to be as organized as the IM community in translating our findings into comparable and upscalable products. So now there is a strong effort, and finally we may have a similar initiative, as the IAM community has been very organized and very good in and systemizing their findings and making them very well accessible and understandable. Perhaps if we are able to do something similar for other types of models which complement the IA wisdom, I think we will be able to inform policymakers better, and in that your model is also could be a very important part.
Thank you for that response. So there's a lot of questions in the Q&A tool. One that was voted up is a question, and that's a question to both of you, is the question of how can we increase the attractiveness, perhaps, or the conceivability of broader society. How can we make that more palatable to people? How can we create and build majorities, societal majorities, for those more transformative scenarios? And that perhaps you can, Diana, answer that for the scientific community, or also broader society. And also, Kai, you could respond. You could talk about how how can we make the concept of degrowth, or the necessity of limiting production and consumption in parts of the world, how can we make that more visible in the climate community, perhaps? That's okay if you want to start, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. I think that's that's the key question. And there is this excellent meme. I don't know if you guys have seen it. I use it often in my talks. A speaker is asking the people, "Do you want change?" And everybody puts up their hands. And then the next question is, "Do you want to change?" And then nobody puts up their hands. Yes, I think this is a little bit the trick, that there is a lot that we recognize is important, but then nobody wants to really. Everybody is afraid of big change in their own lives. And so it's truly a very, very important question. But I think one important way how to communicate this and to emphasize this, and I think Kai put his finger on this very well, and so did you, Linda, is that we are not talking about an austerity scenario, or at least I don't know your scenario that much. But when we talk about in our communities, we have, unfortunately, we have just failed with an important EU proposal on developing similar scenarios. But when we were working on these, what we are emphasizing is that we are not looking at austerity scenarios. These are not about austerity. These are about a better life. This is about that you do have time for your kids to play, instead of purchasing the 15th whichever product that you wouldn't need anyway, just because the commercials are brainwashing you that you actually all you want, you can only be happier with purchasing that, and so on. So it's about well-being. It's about community. It's about health. It's about a better education for more people. But I think that the very difficulties, the most difficulties, that it's not the majority that has to be probably convinced for such a change, but it's some of the most powerful who own presently also the largest wealth, and who is also today often the barrier towards other changes that we know have to happen. So I think that's the challenging. But I'm really interested in what Kai's response is.
Yes, I think I agree with a lot of what Diana said. I think I think one thing I want to make clear is that I don't believe that we save the climate by technology alone, but I also don't believe that we save the climate without larger change in other areas as well. So I think it's wrong to look at the problem of climate justice without looking at things like inequality, racism, sexism, and I think this is also where the change could come from. I think we see more and more, at least in Germany, and from the the countries that I sometimes read about is that we have a lot of social movements, the climate justice movement, and it's joining forces with other movements such as movements against racism, against sexism, for the rights of indigenous people, against class division. And I think seeing these movements come together and see that actually we all want something similar, and that is this big transformation, I think that is a very powerful thing. And then if this is kind of where I put my money on, where the change will come from, hopefully. And of course, then politics can find this topic for themselves and act on it, and so on and so forth. And also the second thing I want to say is that it has come out of style to talk about the future and to be visionary, and I think we have to do exactly that. We should be more visionary than to think about 2100 and just say everything is as it is now, but we have these technologies. We should come up with like better visions of how we want to live. And I think if you look at the literature, I think especially in the scientific area, there's already, I think, this movement that people begin to think much bigger again. And I think this is also something that we should all do. We should think that we should agree, or we should be sure of that things don't have to stay the way they are, and that a better future is possible and imaginable and attainable, and that it's worth it to fight for it, so to say.
Thank you both. So yeah, so I guess what we're trying to do also with the scenario is, even if, or what we're visualizing in that trajectory is also a response to other societal and ecological global crises, right? We're trying to envision trajectories that are capable of addressing these crises as well, rather than exacerbating them, for example, through risk technologies or endless economic growth, even if that's not in sort of the hard modeling itself, right? Because that's where you can input into the model is not all of what we would like to see or all of what we have included in the study, which is more kind of surrounding or context political measures that we think are necessary to accompany the transformation. One other thing that I wanted to briefly pick up is the question of the situation we're in right now. So the global pandemic and what we can perhaps, and Diana, you already mentioned, so the idea is not that we're having degrowth by austerity or degrowth by disaster. That's not the point. And I guess in a similar direction, we could say that also a pandemic-driven economic lockdown is obviously not what we want, but still, I would like to ask you both what it is that you think we can perhaps learn from the experience of the pandemic, or what it is that you think that is connected to the climate crisis, perhaps. If you see any opportunities in how the pandemic was tackled, or how you think the two are linked.
Yes, thank you very much. This is one of my favorite questions, and I just drew up a box for on what we can learn from the pandemic based on what's in the AR6 for our technical summary. So that I really enjoy that topic. Yes, we have to see that there are negative and positive trends, but overall, my own perspective and some of the literature really shares this, that actually the pandemic gives us a historic opportunity to solve the climate crisis. And for several reasons, there are many reasons. But one is, let's pick those which are more related to this particular discussion. One is exactly about change. That even if many of us realize that we should live a little bit differently and so on, but the scientific literature actually shows that it's very difficult for us to change lifestyles, except when our lives are undergoing anyway some major change. For example, when we give birth, when we move houses, when we start a new job, these are the opportunities when we get kids and so on, that when our situation anyway changes a lot, then we actually are able to fundamentally change lifestyles. So what else is the pandemic now doing to our lives? We are having a planetary scale laboratory experiment of lifestyle disruptions. So this is a good chance to actually reflect on really what's important to us, and that perhaps there are alternative ways of lives, or just things that we do in other ways that can be done differently, and perhaps they are also acceptable. And one in that is, for example, cities and urban mobility is something which has been severely disrupted. And what we see also, for example, in Germany, but not only in Germany, but many most developed countries in the world, that, for example, that active mobility has increased several hundreds of percent during lockdowns. But what we see is that it does not come down significantly after the lockdowns are over. So people actually start to enjoy. They realize, wow, actually, this isn't so bad. Maybe actually I'm actually better off biking to work rather than sitting in my very expensive and fantastic car, but being stuck in traffic. So, of course, the other trend is there as well, that unfortunately public transport, so lots of people got out of public transport. So that's why I'm saying that there are multiple trends, but this is one. But there are also many others. We learned just the fact that you have invited me for this event now. Probably, a year ago, this may not have happened. Now I'm speaking at many events around the world, and before that was not an acceptable option. This way, I can address 3 conferences a day globally in different parts of the planet, which was just not palatable a few months ago. So anyway, we are learning many things in a new way, and I think what's really important is to recognize what are the positive parts of this transformation that we are going through, especially the digital transformation, because the pandemic has definitely accelerated the digital transformation that we have been saying that this is crucial to a low carbon future, transform to service-based and digitally based economy. But what we need to look at from this mega scale laboratory experiment is what are the aspects where we can either handle the negative consequences, because we know that there are negative consequences, of course, to social contacts and community and so on. Whereas when we can handle this, and where it's absolutely positive, so that we consciously preserve this. For example, I would question whether, high school students, do they really need to go to school every day, or could they go, let's say, do 3 to 2, or at least 4 to 1, even in the long term? And there are many new questions to ask. But also there are many other aspects, all the way from the very positive shaking up of energy markets, where we see that fossil fuels, I think presently coal is now down by 37%, so very significantly since the pandemic, very significant loser from this pandemic, whereas we see that renewables are actually really winning from the pandemic. So there are many aspects which really have given us a new chance to win the climate game. And I think this, together with the recent developments, which is, for example, the US elections and the Southeast Asian commitments to climate neutrality, I think definitely these are giving us together, or making it that 2020, although it has been a terrible year, but actually it may be such a unique year again as 2015 was, with the Paris Agreement, with the SDGs. So this may actually give us another chance to continue the very positive developments of 2015.
Thank you, Diana. Kai, you also have a response, and yeah, we're soon to finish, so please be brief.
Sure, I try to be brief. I think, there's a lot of things that you can learn from this pandemic, but maybe the 3 things I want to focus on is, first up, governments are able to introduce measures to reduce consumption and production, which was often debated by growth proponents. Secondly, this does have a very direct effect on emissions, as we can see now. And thirdly, I think that right now we see how very much growth dependent or even growth addicted our society is, because now that the growth is absent and all these other crises loom, by people lose their jobs and their livelihood, government finances come into jeopardy, and we see that everything is done to spur new growth, just as we saw with the financial crisis, with subsidies for the industrial sectors and all these things. And I think the result is that the crisis is once more resolved on the backs of the care workers, of the taxpayers, and not actually touching the richer people. And because they're so important for economic growth, and so they stay untouched. And I think if we would change our system so that we don't rely on economic growth as much, we would also be much more resilient when it comes to these crises.
Thank you both. So as I said, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll close now. This was just, hopefully, just the beginning of many more conversations around these topics. Thank you very much again to Diana and Kai for being with us today, and also to all of you in the audience for your interest. I'm really sorry we didn't get to answer all of the questions that were put to us in the chat box or in the Q&A. So if you have more questions, or if you would like to discuss any of this further with us, you're welcome to email us. Perhaps my colleagues could put our email contacts in the chat box. And we're also, we'll see if we can convene more of those conversations perhaps next year. So yeah, thank you very much again. And also thank you to all of the people who supported the event from the technical side. And yeah, I wish you all a good and hopefully restful end of this year. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
For the invitation.